so a lot of what I think about is how do we build these systems to work well for the actual end goal of research or helping with clinical care. And so I'll just give you a little bit of the background on the technology. So where we're coming from is that there's now perhaps over 5 billion phones out there, of course, all varying degrees. For example, here today, who here has a smartphone? I would be curious. Okay. And who here uses that smartphone for more than email and web browsing? So has downloaded an app to the phone to do something. Okay, so the context of mobile apps on smartphones I see is very familiar here. And so what we think about when we're looking at smartphones is not just how can we create a cool app, but also what are the types of data that we can collect on this phone, because these devices are on us all the time. We have them, we're constantly interacting with them, and so we see a real opportunity here for really collecting more higher resolution, fine-grained understandings of people's behaviors, their contexts, who they interact with, everything that impacts health in a way that is otherwise inaccessible in a clinical setting. And so as a step to that, one of the things that we started doing was working with health researchers and looking at how can we develop a software platform that would run on these phones that would help researchers who are researching health better, trying to also get a better understanding of people's context and all of the things that impact their health. And so Dallas's group with Mary Jane were our first collaborators, and they have been brave, patient, wonderful people. And so maybe 3 or 4 years ago, as Dallas mentioned, we started working with them, and we gave them our sort of first valiant attempts at an application that runs on a smartphone to collect data. And so they, started trying them out, gave us lots of input, designed the application with us, and over the years we've tried many, many different versions, many different things, and we've come across a number of different problems so that we now have a platform that is robust enough that we are able to give it out to populations for studies. And so what I'll talk about is a little bit of our process of how we got there, including our focus groups, our interviews, some results from people who have actually used the app, and show you a little bit of the app itself, which actually Dallas also showed you, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But please interrupt me at any point with questions, or even if they're off topic or whatnot. It's nice to just sort of have more of a conversation. Okay, so we started out by thinking about, okay, we have ecological momentary assessment, experience sampling. It's an existing sort of established method. And what can we do to improve or make this method stronger using the technologies that exist on smartphones today? And so we thought about a couple of different things. One of them was that it's possible to do a rough approach to actigraphy or activity data. And that's because we have what's called a triaxial accelerometer on the phone, which gives you movement in three dimensions. And we also have GPS on the phone, which gives you your speed as well as your location. So the first thing we came up with was, okay, let's add actigraphy to the current experience sampling method. The second thing is that, well, because we have the GPS, we can also do some smarter reminders. Instead of asking people to just pick up their phone and remember to fill out a survey, well, we can prompt them in different ways. We can prompt them based on their location. We can prompt them based on what they're doing. If somebody's been sitting at their desk for 5 hours, the phone knows that to a certain extent and can send them a prompt. So the second thing that we added to experience sampling is really thinking about these smarter types of prompts. And then the third thing that we wanted to add was real-time feedback. So because, again, as I mentioned, that people have their phones with them all the time, and the phones are recording, monitoring, whatnot, the phones have this unique ability to give people feedback on their behaviors and what they've been doing, and help serve as a mirror of sorts to sort of reflect back to them what has been going on. And of course, all of this is mediated by how accurate people's responses are to surveys and how accurate the phone itself is to capturing this data. And this gets a little bit at your question of the data analysis, which is that there are a number of sources of error on the phone, which I'll talk a little about. And so every conclusion, anything we pull from this is completely mediated by those many sources of error. So one of the approaches that we have is that we learn by trying. And so we develop something and then we try to get it out there and get it used. And so we tend to just work with a number of different health collaborators to get our phone applications used to get feedback from them. So one of these studies, which I'll talk about today, is a study on young moms looking at how we can reduce risk factors for cardiovascular disease in this population, because cardiovascular disease is actually one of the number one killers of women in America today, as I understand it. I'm a computer scientist, but I get a little nervous talking to people who obviously know much more than I do about this. But so anyways, we wanted to do this study, and this was something that Mary Jane had suggested would be a good use. And so we proposed a study a pilot study to explore the feasibility. And the premise of this study was to do two things. Was one, a validity and reliability of the phone EMA measures. Because we're saying, okay, we're going to extend this accepted method of EMA in these three different ways, but how do we know how well this is working? And generally, how do we know how well the EMA is working? Because there are a number of sources of error. So in some ways, rhetorically, EMA does improve validity and reliability over data, because if I ask you, how are you feeling right now, if you wanted to, you could likely give me a much more accurate answer to that question than if I asked you, how were you feeling 3 months ago? And there's a number of reasons for that. I may not remember. I may have had 5,000 different feelings in the last 3 months, so it's a little hard for me to answer that question. Or, since that time has passed, a number of things may have happened that may make me not want to share that data with you anymore. So asking people how they're feeling in the moment perhaps gives us a more valid and reliable response to that question. On the other hand, it might also be that asking somebody how they're feeling in this moment gives us a less valid and reliable response, because how I'm feeling in this current moment may be mediated by the fact that I had to wait 30 minutes to get ice cream, but it may not actually be reflective of how I'm feeling overall. And so there's some things to really explore here around how well does it work to give people a phone and ask them how they're feeling, and how often do I have to ask you? So if I want to know how you're feeling and what your general stress, depression, sad mood is, do I have to ask you twice a day? Do I have to ask you 15 times a day? At what point do I really start to understand what it is that I'm trying to get at? So in order to really try to characterize this, we proposed a study to explore the validity and reliability of the phones. And then the second aim of the study was also to look at how do we design an application to make it attractive and feasible for people to use, because what we had found in our preliminary studies was that it's actually a real pain to have to answer surveys 3-4 times a day on your phone. The surveys are short, they're a minute long, but it's still one more thing that's on our to-do list. The other thing is that the software that we run is inconvenient for people because we're constantly collecting this background data, as Dallas mentioned, in order to get at the actigraphy, but that drains the battery more quickly. So maybe now I have to charge my phone once or twice a day. So there's a number of reasons why participating in this kind of data collection, whether it's for your own behavior management or to provide data for a study, it's actually a lot of burden on people. And so we really need to think a lot about how do we make these applications engaging, and especially in sort of a Web 2.0 world with all of these different things pulling at our attention. As a researcher who wants to use a mobile phone in their study, one of the things that one might want to consider is, will my participants actually use this technology to provide data for me? So those were the two overall goals of the study that we wanted to address. So the first one was really figuring out how do we design an application that would be attractive to people, and so what would they want? And so we set out to do a number of different focus groups. And Dallas is going to jump in as needed. But so we did focus groups. Actually, I'm going to skip this slide. Sorry, we did focus groups with two diverse populations. One was with people living with HIV, and the second population was with young moms. And the goal really here was to inform how do we develop an application that's attractive and feasible and addresses people's concerns. And we benefited from the fact that the focus groups were with these two different diverse populations because the goal ultimately was to develop a general platform that arguably would be attractive and feasible regardless of population, regardless of the domain that was being monitored. And so we set out to do these focus groups by giving people sort of a sample scenario. And with the people living with HIV, because it was with a study that Dallas was conducting with CHIPTS, people were asked, okay, if you were going to be given a smartphone application to monitor sex behavior, illegal drug use, what are the types of concerns you would have? What are the barriers to use? That kind of a thing. And then in the focus groups with moms, we asked them if you were, because that was for reducing cardiovascular disease risk factors. With the focus groups with moms, we asked them if you were to have to monitor diet, stress, and exercise, what are the types of barriers to use? What would be important to you? So those were the two different framings with these two different populations. We ended up with about 60, a little less than 60 people across these 5 different focus groups. And so the first thing we found that there were a number of themes that were common to both of these populations. Around prompts, we wanted to know about frequency and all that I've mentioned, so we found, okay, 3 or 4 surveys a day seemed acceptable. One of the things that was interesting was that moms who tended to be young moms with multiple young kids at home, so were very pressed for time, really thought a lot about user burden. For them, that was like the driving focus of the conversation. And so, for example, when we said if we wanted to ask them a survey, questions about how they were feeling in the moment, we said, well, okay, that might be okay, but we'd really rather end of day, we put the kids to bed, and then you can ask me more about it. So that's the first thing that really came out of the focus groups to inform our design. The other thing was that customizable reminders were really key, and people living with HIV were really interested in reminders that could be customized to help with safe sex as well as medication adherence. And they were very interested in location reminders. One of the anecdotes that came out that I remember was a couple of people who said that when they were taking their medication, they much preferred to do it at home. And so a home-based reminder that anytime I walk into my home says, have you taken your medication yet today, they found very attractive.
Yeah, and I'll just say for the incentives for people with HIV about the, kind of risky behaviors and so on, they basically said, depends on how much you pay me.
Right.
That was their line. It was all about the money. So they said, if you pay me, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So that was different than the long term. Long term, you could bring up money as an issue, but that was about time.
So, and socioeconomic status was a little different as well, and that must have also impacted.
People with HIV were really marginalized, like I said, were disabled, on disability, unemployed typically, and kind of would be considered maybe professional researchers.
Right. So in the moms population, a number of people had smartphones, but that wasn't a entrance criteria. I forget what
Only
they
one
call it.
person in the focus group that had a smartphone.
In the people living with HIV.
Very,
Yeah.
very low smartphone.
Yeah, and so we intentionally didn't ask. That wasn't like a criteria because we just wanted to know generally if somebody were to use a smartphone application, what would they be thinking about?
Do you find that since it's not their phone, that they are not likely to carry that on? Because, I wouldn't want to carry on an external phone because they get
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think I left out that plot, but what we found, we've done studies now with probably, I don't know, a couple of hundred people across a number of different populations. And one of the things that we have found is that when when we have studies with people who are using their own phones, they're much more likely to interact with the phone and submit more data. Whereas, exactly as you say, I mean, when we have to give people phones, not only is it a major pain logistically, by the way, to give people phones and manage all that, but also they're not going to be as likely to interact with it. So absolutely, a study where you can leverage people's phones that they have, and in fact make it a criteria that says you can be part of the study if you have an Android phone or whatever, is definitely, you're going to get much more reliable data. On the flip side, I will just say that because our software does continuously collect data in the background, some people are a little hesitant, understandably, because it will drain their battery faster. We are starting to collect more intrusive data for certain studies, so we are encrypting SMS phone numbers. The phone numbers that people call are from SMS messages. And it's encrypted, so it's not about the specific number, but more, you know, do you have a small number of people that you interact with a lot of times, or a large network of people that you interact with rarely? So we're really trying to understand that type of data, but people are, of course, hesitant to have this kind of stuff running on their phone. So there's a lot of plus minus trade-offs.
What about the other way around? What about somebody who has a cheap phone that doesn't do very much, and you say, here, here's a smartphone?
Absolutely, it's an incentive.
Right, so then once they get used to the phone and it becomes their phone, then do you get that effect that you get with people who have the smartphone in the first place, that they interact with it and they tend to give you more data?
It's a great question. Yeah, we don't know.
Okay.
Because we
Don't know
haven't
yet.
done
That's
this
what you would think.
long enough. But
Yeah.
So I have some experience with relation because that's exactly the population. Did not have smartphones before the study.
Yeah.
And
maybe didn't have a phone at all
and
in some cases.
No, they had to have phones or say they had phones,
Okay.
but didn't have a smartphone. And they're actually doing the surveys a lot. And in some cases, they wouldn't do the web retrospective surveys, but
Yeah.
they would do the phone surveys every day. So they really, and we even got some I think, qualitative data talking about how they really enjoyed or liked doing the surveys on the phone. They seem particularly into it. More the people that were doing it.
Did you see any sort of longitudinal effects that it took them a while to ramp up or anything like
We
that?
haven't looked at it closely yet, but I
Okay.
think that's definitely, one person kind of said, yeah, I was just kind of getting it into my routine after 6 weeks and now the study's done.
Oh, that's interesting.
Not that it took them 6 weeks to figure it out, but it was finally becoming part of their daily routine, like really
Right.
ingrained in their routine,
Right.
and the study is done.
Right.
But we're worried about Nithya's study because that's 6 months of moms carrying phones doing case one. That, I'm curious to see what happens.
Very, very
And
curious.
the study ends, the phone goes stays with them, or you take it back?
They have the option to keep the phone or get money, I believe, but they're all taking money.
We're kind of going back and forth as well. The other thing is we didn't want to tell people what we were going to do with that in terms of, we just said you're going to get money as an incentive. And then at the end, what we might say is that you have the choice of keeping the phone or getting the money, is I think what we may do, and just leave it up to them. So if they prefer to hold on to the phone, because we don't want to take something away that they've integrated into their routine.
And then if they're all poor and they can't afford the service.
Data plan, exactly, which is why they might not want the phone, in which case they said give me the money. And we may just end up giving them the phone anyways, I mean,
Give them the money and the phone.
right. Yeah, no.
You can end up, the IRB will tell you what.
You can keep collecting data.
Right,
Absolutely.
exactly.
Take the phone.
You're right,
Take the phone.
That's like
30
the
years
interviewer
from now,
who,
you'll still be collecting data.
it's like the interviewer who says, I'm gonna leave the room for a minute and leaves the microphone on to get the real data. Yeah, for the record, IRB, we're not doing that.
Question about consent. How do you sort of using for consent? I'm assuming there's so much technology involved that people might not understand. How do you?
Yeah. So we're very lucky to have a wonderful study coordinator who does all of that, but it is something that it takes a significant amount of extra time to get through all of that, because people do have a lot of questions, especially people who have smartphones, I think, are sort of more curious because they sort of know the power of the smartphone. But yeah, it definitely is well integrated into our consent forms, into our recruitment scripts, into all of that, and it is a lot of extra.
What percentage of people would you say would say no once they find out if they live in America?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're not recording that, which now I wish we had. It's a good point. From what my study coordinator has said, not many. it's not really about the data in the mom study. Which makes sense because in the mom study we're asking diet, stress, and exercise, and we're not collecting that additional information about like people you contact and all of that. So it's pretty minimally invasive, which is what came out in the focus groups as well.
Right.
Moms were like, we kept sort of trying to ask about privacy, and moms would say, we don't care. This seems fine. You're just asking about my diet, stress, and exercise. So we haven't had that. We've had a couple of people, not many, maybe like a couple percent, who once they really understand what's required in terms of the surveys 4 times a day and getting them actigraphy data, just the burden, they have dropped out and just said, "This, I didn't realize this was such a commitment." And also because as part of the study, we are collecting blood samples 3 times over 6 months. So it's people have dropped out because of that. There's another question. Okay. And then the other thing I'll mention is that, so in terms of themes that were especially important to both populations, goal setting, motivational messaging, this was really exciting to people. And actually there's a third set of focus groups that I didn't include here for a couple of reasons, but we did focus groups with South Asian women in Chicago, and they were actually, this was the only thing that they wanted to talk about was the goal setting. And we really found that with the moms as well, that people really said, if this is part of a behavior change program, this is going to help me lose weight. That was a very common one, but also reduce stress. Then I would be willing to do a lot more. So in the context of an intervention, people were really willing to kind of take on the burden of this application. Whereas in the context of like you're just collecting data for research, people are like, well, I guess I'd be willing to do it. But that concept of like, well, how much are you going to pay me, that really comes in. And why this is important is because the concept of informational incentives, I think, is really important, even for researchers who are trying to get lots of data from people. If they're providing a service back to end users, what we found is that these participants were really willing to do a lot if they thought that this was actually going to be useful for them or something.
Which is why it's probably reasonable to pay people to give you data.
If you don't have the goal setting,
Yeah.
or if you do.
Yeah, if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's totally reasonable. Okay. I think I'll try to just keep this to another 3 or 4 minutes. So I'll just mention one thing here, which is that people living with HIV really, of course, were concerned about privacy and security of their data. We did find that they did want to share their data with a healthcare provider, a coach or something, but that they wanted anonymization or various selective release of certain types of data, all of that. So that was important. Okay, so I'll just mention one thing on this slide. So we developed this application based on all the focus group data that we collected, as well as feedback from other users and researchers. And so we have this phone application now that does provide the patient and time-triggered surveys, provides lots of different ways to collect data on the survey. This concept came out of the focus group with the moms, which was a stress button. So moms said that they wanted a button that they could just press on the phone that wouldn't ask them a survey or a question, but would just record stress, the location, and time. So that's something that really, I think, captured a lot of people if we've made available. And people are using it, by the way. And then we have the actigraphy and other types of background data questions. Alice mentioned the audio and all of that. And we're starting to explore phone-based activities like games that people can start doing to, for example, you can assess sleep and cognitive deficiencies by providing a game on the phone that measures your response time. So to skip through all of this, we're starting to think a lot more about how do we make sense of all this data, and that is a real challenge, which Scott will talk about more. And so one final thing I'll mention here is that we are thinking about how do we make these configurable, personalizable, but also scriptable. So it means that a researcher can come and set up one of these, or different ways that we can make this easier to set up these campaigns. Number of clinical pilots. I mentioned one thing here, which is that so we've done pilot studies with a number of different populations. This is about 670 people here, shown here. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that the question of, so people were asked these questions at the end of the pilot personal discovery. And we found that a great number of people were interested in this kind of tool that would help them learn more about their own behaviors. And I can attest to that myself, actually. I learned a lot about my own stress levels from using this application. Not long. Every day I used it for about a month, and it was just the act of answering the questions that I started realizing, like, wow, I actually answer stressed more than I would have realized. And when I looked back, I felt that that matched my general retrospective understanding as well. So I think there is something about sort of this frequent questioning. So I will mention one other thing here, which is that we want to think about how the phone data can be used almost like a biomarker. And so, a biomarker gives us this objective measure about something very specific. And is there a way that we could think about the data on the phones giving us that kind of a marker, but for our larger health? So a marker for depression, for example. And so we think about that in terms of, well, if we're collecting actigraphy data, activity data, can we start analyzing it to figure out how often do you get out during the day? What's the diameter of your life? How far do you get from your house? And can we start making sense of that and really thinking about markers for depression, for sedentism, and other aspects that really impact health? So I think I've mentioned one more slide, and then I think I'm going to be done here, which is that one of the things that we're doing with our mom study is thinking about how to give people feedback. And so moms are enrolling in this 6-month study. The first 3 months, we're collecting data in order to establish a baseline on that behavior. And then in the next 3 months, we give them feedback on what they're doing compared to that baseline that we established in the first 3 months. And so this is our current phone application, which every day now you can go to this chart and you can look at, okay, for food quality, for example, my baseline says that my medium, I normally have medium quality food. That's the dashed line right there. And then I can see where was I last week and where am I currently this week. So you can start understanding how your current performance compares to a baseline. And what we want to look at is, does that in any way, getting this kind of feedback, does that lead to any kind of behavior change?